Hey everyone, SmartyPants Chess here. Again, we're watching a CCC11 finals game between Stockfish and Leela Chess 0. In this game, Stockfish plays white and Leela is playing black. And the opening is incredibly weird. So it goes d4, knight to f6, and now they decided the opening move would be g4. So I've never seen this opening before in my life. But black plays knight takes g4, sacking a pawn. White plays f3. Black plays knight to f6, and then there's e4 and d6, and this is the end of the book. Now, in the other alternate game where both sides are switched, this was actually a draw, so Leela managed to draw this position as white, and now she's playing black with an extra pawn. So play continued on with Stockfish playing bishop to e3, developing. Leela develops to knight c6, knight c3 is played, and Leela plays e5. I don't think white should take this pawn because after takes, and trade of queens and knight takes, castles queenside and a6. This is actually really nice for black because a6 stops the bishop or the knight getting into this square, and black is just a whole pawn up. Easy game for black really. So back to the game, Stockfish put some pressure on black with bishop to b5, pinning the knight on c6, and Leela played knight to d7 to block the pin. White could have attempted d5 here, but then black just plays knight e7, prepares f5, and there's no longer a pin on the knight on c6. Again, black has a very easy game. So in the game, Stockfish played knight ge2 instead, and black played a6, attacking the bishop, and Stockfish decided to double black's pawns on the c-file, so bishop takes c6, and b takes c6. Now maybe here Stockfish should have just developed normally with queen to d2. Play could continue queen h4, bishop f2 and queen h3. Stockfish could have continued with f4 and then black played g6, castle queenside and bishop h6. Again, I still think black has a really good advantage here. They've got the extra pawn, but white's sort of slowly getting into the game and there's some ideas here for white. So I'm sure white should have probably gone in for this position. Instead, Stockfish decided to play d5, blocks everything up in the centre. I'm not sure this is the way to go. Of course, white does have two knights. And again, in a human game, I probably would have played like this because humans are susceptible to mistakes. But it's going to be very difficult for black to make a mistake in this position. Leela's not really prone to that many errors. So play continued on anyway, c5, queen d2 and then a5. So black's got a real nice clamp on white's position now. They've got a nice pawn chain in the centre. Just really limits the scope of this bishop on e3. And this a5 move also stops breaks like b4 from happening. And now black's just simply going to play bishop to a6, get a nice white squared diagonal, and infiltrate behind these white squared pawns. Stockfish anyway played b3, this stops any a4 ideas for black, and black does indeed play bishop to a6. Stockfish castle queenside, and Leela played g6, knight a4 was played, knight to b6, attacking the knight on a4, and the knight goes to c3 to defend its mate on a4. I think Leela did the wise thing, she just traded knights, knight takes a4, knight takes a4 and bishop g7. Again, effectively black's winning this game because they're just a pawn up and has the two bishops now. It's going to be up for white now to maybe try and blockade the position and try and limit the black in the endgame. So Stockfish played h4, again Leela just plays h5, so just blocks everything up. I should just note that if queen takes a5 per Stockfish here, bishop e2 just wins material because the queen is attacked and the rook on d1 is attacked. So now Stockfish played c4, stops black from playing c4 as well, any breaks, and Leela just castled, queen e2 was played and then just rook b8. King c2 and then king h7 and knight c3, bishop h6, and there's a trade again, bishop takes h6, king takes and queen d2 check, and the king went backwards. So Leela's just got rid of another pair of minor pieces. Again, this helps black, just a whole pawn up. The centre is completely blocked out though, so all the pawns are on white squares and black's bishop is also on a white square. So black will probably have to reroute the bishop back to c8 perhaps, onto this line, and try and push some of these pawns up to create a queen chance. So after king h7, Stockfish again just tries to blockade everything, a4. Bishop c8 as predicted, and they jump in with the knight to b5, preparing knight to a7, knight to c6, and also this queen on d2 attacks this pawn on a5, So Leela's forced to play rook to a8 to defend a7 and the a5 pawn with this nice rook. f4 is played by Stockfish, and of course Leela has to take this. She could maybe play f6. f6 is a move perhaps, but then maybe, I don't know, I think white can just keep the tension with rook to f1 perhaps. They don't have to take this pawn on e5 straight away. But even so, after f4, Leela just captured anyway. E takes f4. Queen takes f4 was played, and Leela played f6 anyway. King to b2 from Stockfish, queen e7, rook to e1 to protect the e4 pawn, and rook to f7 to protect the c7 pawn. So black's just defending, and will probably eventually, once they've got the pieces in order, maybe move the bishop to d7, possibly move the rook to the e file, and maybe even move the queen up to e5 with this nice square and trade queens off. For this reason I think Stockfish plays king a3 to stop the trade of queens, but queen e5 is played anyway. If Stockfish traded here with queen takes, then I think black can play d takes e5. If rook h2, there's bishop g4. And after king to b2 and g5, black's really getting into the game, pushing these pawns up the board, preparing moves like f5 with a nice break, and even just taking this pawn off and playing f5 afterwards. So black's got a very nice position. For this reason, Stockfish avoided taking the queen, played queen f2. Black played bishop to g4. Rook h f1 was played, and bishop h3 attacking the rook. So the rook goes backwards, and there's a bit of back and forth we see in these computer games. Just a lot of manoeuvring. So again, just moving the rooks back and forth. Rook h1, queen g3. Eventually queen e5 is played, queen d2, and then rook f7. So eventually, after a few more moves, we get to a position where black actually tries to make a break for it. So rook h f1, and now black plays f5, attacking the pawn on e4. Takes, and f5 is played by Stockfish, and g takes f5 is played. Bishop takes was also possible, but I think white gets some advantage with rook to g1, king h7, and queen g5. So they get into the game more compared to the previous variation. Even after rook e8 and rook f1, again black's got a bit of defending to do, and I think Leela just preferred the variation where she takes with the g pawn. This makes a lot more sense because they've got a passed pawn now, and still they're dominating the position. This bishop on g4 is now protected by two pawns as well, and possibly black has more chances to attack this h pawn with like queen f6 for instance, and attack the pawn. Rook b1 was played by Stockfish. Leela played queen to e3, so trying to trade queens off. Stockfish finally accepts. Queen takes e3, rook takes e3, and of course Leela just gives up pawn on c7 with knight takes c7. But this really helps black out now because they don't have to defend this a5 pawn from the queen that was on d2. So now they use the rook to their advantage with rook to b8. Has a very nice open file for their rook, and now attacks the b3 pawn twice. Also, black sacrifices that weak c7 pawn, but basically black's going to try and hoover up this pawn on h4 at a later date. Stockfish continued with knight to e6 check. The king moved up, and king a2 was played. King f6, rook f1, and rook h3. So again, Leela's going to win this pawn on h4. If rook h1 here, then black can just win a pawn back with rook takes b3. And if rook takes h3, just take on h3 as well. And also, if rook takes b3, black will just play rook takes h1, and then just pick up the pawn on h4 afterwards. So this is a very nice position for black to be in. After rook h3 though, knight to f4 was played. After knight to f4, strangely Leela didn't take this pawn on h4. I think if rook takes h4, maybe Leela was worried about rook to e1 perhaps, where white might have some chances with rook to e6 check perhaps. But anyway, after knight to f4, Leela actually just played rook to e3, gaining the open file again. Knight e6 was played, rook h3 again, and now rook to f2. Here it was perfectly acceptable for black to take rook takes h4. This is absolutely fine for black, but Leela opted for a different approach, just rook e8 first, rook to f1, and then finally Leela did take this pawn on h4. And again, now she's a whole pawn up once again. Knight to f4 was played, rook to e5 to defend, king to b2, rook to e4, king to b1, and again there's some manoeuvring with the pieces shuffling around. and eventually rook g3, king a3, and then of course a few more moves. So eventually you get to a position now where eventually black does make a big sacrifice here. So after king c2, Leela now plays rook h3 and sacks the exchange. So Stockfish of course takes this, knight takes h3, bishop takes, and rook c1. So what does black gain for this? Well, they've got a bishop and a pawn for the rook, and this should be enough to convert. Black's got two passed pawns here, supported by the king, the bishop, and the rook, so this should be enough to win the game. Again, it's not the amount of points that's important for the pieces, it's the amount of squares they control. So play continued on with f4, and now black's just going to crush white with these two pawns. b4 was played by Stockfish, trying to create their own passed pawn. Because after c takes b4, which was played, there was c5, which was played and takes. White plays d6, so they've got their own passed pawn on the d file. But after bishop to g4, black's in a perfectly nice position. Rook d5 was possible here to get behind the pawn, and I've got a nice variation where after rook d2, play continues with bishop f5, king d1, bishop d3, and black will win the pawn on the d file. d7, rook takes d7, but white has some chances with rook takes c5, king g4, rook takes a5, and b3. But eventually, after several more moves, black gets in a very nice position. They've got three passed pawns here, and uses the power of the bishop to use a discovered check to again win the exchange back. And after king f3, this should be an easy win for black. They've got moves like b2 coming up, and even just trying to push these pawns up the board. Very nice position with an advantage for black. Back to the game though, black didn't play rook to d5, Leela just played bishop g4. The bishop is looking after this nice d7 square, so white has to get a rook behind the pawn eventually. They play rook cf1 first to attack the f-pawn. The pawn goes to f3, defended by the bishop. Rook d2 to get behind this pawn. So black does have to defend this with rook to e8. They can't allow rook to d8 to come, so after d7 for instance, black might be in trouble. King d3 was played, king f4 controlling some more squares, king c4, attacking the pawn on c5, and then rook c8 was played to defend the pawn. I think if d7 here, I think black can just play rook to d8, and if king takes, then just rook takes, takes, and again black should be in a perfectly acceptable position to win the game. Bishop even attacks this a4 pawn. So in the game, after rook to c8, rook c2 was played, h4 was played, and then rook to d2, h3, king b5. So black's just slowly getting the pawns up the board, and after king e3 to attack the rook, rook h2, and then c4. So after king takes a5, c3, king takes b4 and c2, black's threatening to play c1 and get a queen, so rook e1 is played with check, the king goes back to f4, and rook c1 blocks black from getting a queen. But now black can just push their other pawns, king g3 attacking the rook goes to d2, and then there's f2. So black's threatening to play moves like f1 and then c1, so white has to do something. They play d7 to try and get a queen of their own. Black defends, and then rook takes c2. So white's just won a pawn back, but then of course just rook takes d7, black's won their pawn. Rook f1 attacking this f2 pawn, and the rook gets behind the pawn to defend. King a3 and then king to g2 attacking the rook. White's forced to put their rook on the back rank, rook to c1 to defend the rook, but now just bishop to e2, and this is pretty much game over for white. They've got to sacrifice their rook for the pawn. Rook takes f2, black recaptured, and then rook c7, h2, and after rook to g7, king f1, king h7, king g1, check, and then blocks with the rook. Very nice technique. Rook h7, rook to g5. A very nice move, stopping white from playing a5. Rook h4, rook to g3, and after a few more moves, eventually black does promote this pawn to take on a4 first. So they've capitalised, finally promotes to a queen, rook takes h1, king takes, and eventually it's king and rook checkmate for black against Stockfish. So that was an incredibly nice, simple game by Leela once again. And I say this again, it's very Karpovian and Carlsen-like. They just won a pawn in a dubious opening for white, which was a gambit. So black was a pawn up throughout the whole game, and Leela just converts it nicely. But again, I think these openings are a bit dubious, but it demonstrates that Leela is actually a better engine, because Stockfish actually drew that position when they were pawn up as black, whereas Leela has just won it and made it look very simple. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been SpiderPants Chess. If you did like my videos, please drop a like, comment or subscribe. And also add me on chess.com or LeeChess if you like. It'd be great to play a few of you in some games. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video.